Hello, today's story is called The Fairy Cloak. Niall was a hard-working young farmer with just one problem. He didn't have enough land to work. His little farm was on a spit of land that was surrounded on three sides by the sea, so he knew that he couldn't expect to find any more land in that direction, and his neighbor on the fourth side refused to sell to him, even though he wasn't farming his land. He just liked owning it. But if Niall was going to make a decent living, he needed more land. Now, when he was a child, he'd often crept out of bed at night and hidden at the top of the stairs, listening avidly to the adults sitting around the fire, telling tales of fairies, leprechauns, and ghosts. And now that he was grown up, he found the stories hard to believe. He'd never actually seen one of the little people. But there was one story that stuck in his mind because it gave him some hope of a solution to his problem. It was said that once every 7 years, the tide went right out as far as the horizon. And when that happened, the little people arrived for a party. They had a big blanket that they spread out on the sand, and this blanket was able to keep the tide back so that the sea wouldn't come in to spoil their fun. Not only that, any land that was held back by the blanket in this way was magically turned into good farming land, where you could grow anything at all that you wanted, as long as you were in possession of that blanket. Now, Niall thought that there must be some way that he could make use of this strange event. When he was still a child, he'd crept out of the house on the night of the little people's party and hidden behind the big rocks at the edge of the beach. And sure enough, the tide rolled right out as far as the eye could see, and along came a big crowd of little people, leprechauns and fairies and sprites. And one of the leprechauns reached into his leather purse and pulled out a small piece of folded cloth. He shook it out, and it spread out and out until it covered a large bit of the dry land. And then a group of leprechauns sat on the blanket, got out their cobbling tools, and began to hammer at the tiny shoes they had brought with them. A couple of leprechauns were playing their fiddles while the others worked, and the fairies and sprites were dancing. And as long as the leprechauns sat there, the tide stayed out. And all the while the grass was growing, so that by the time they stood up, folded up the blanket and disappeared, the whole beach looked like good pasture land, until the tide came in again and swallowed it up. Now tonight was the night of the little people's party, and Niall had decided that he'd get his hands on that blanket by hook or by crook. He muffled his horse's hoofs with bits of sacking, and he rode in the direction of the shore. He tethered the horse close to the spot where he had hidden 7 years earlier, and as he approached the rocks, he could hear the fairy music wafting towards him on the breeze, and he got closer. And there they were again, the little group of leprechauns sitting on their magic blanket and repairing their tiny shoes, tapping away in time to the lilting music. Now there was a strong breeze that night, and Niall could see that the four corners of the blanket were flapping. He thought that if he could just get hold of one corner, he could pull the blanket out from under the leprechauns. He moved carefully forward, keeping to the shadows. But no matter how far he went, he still seemed to have the same distance to go, and the shoreline was getting further and further away. Finally, he reached the edge of the blanket. Crouching down, he put his hand out and took hold of a corner with a firm grasp. And gritting his teeth, he tugged at the blanket, and it worked. He had pulled the blanket out from under the leprechauns. Then, without warning, everything was plunged into complete darkness, and he could hear the leprechauns shouting, as he raced off in the direction of his horse, the magic blanket in his hand. Suddenly, all the noise and confusion stopped, and it became very quiet. That's that then, thought Niall. I've done it. I've got the blanket, and the leprechauns have disappeared. He climbed on his horse, tucking the blanket, which was as fine as gossamer, in his pocket, and he galloped in the direction of his farmhouse. And as he rode, he thought he heard a faint rumbling sound, which got louder and louder and louder. And he turned around, and what did he see but an enormous wave heading towards him? He spurred his horse, galloping as fast as he could to keep ahead of it. Suddenly he was swept off his horse, and he felt lots of little hands beating him and pulling at him. Then as suddenly as it had appeared, the wave disappeared, and Niall was left lying on the ground, exhausted. He fell into a deep sleep and woke up feeling as sore and stiff as if he'd just fought in a battle. Thank goodness I survived that, he thought, and at least I still have the fairy blanket, safe and sound, so I'll soon have all the land I need. He could feel the blanket in his pocket, and he reached in to pull it out, and imagine his surprise when all he found was a handful of wet, slimy seaweed. And that was the last time anyone managed to get their hands on the fairy blanket. If you go down to the shore every 7 years on the appointed day, you'll find the leprechauns sitting on that blanket, chatting and singing and tapping away at their shoes. And if you look very closely, you'll see that the corners of the blanket are tied to the ground with 4 magic tent pegs. And that's the story of the fairy blanket.